Something changed around Jannik Sinner in the last few days, and it wasn't announced, it wasn't posted on social media, and it had nothing to do with fitness, injuries, or physical conditioning. But inside the tour, people noticed immediately. Because when a player like Sinner, the most stable, methodical, and predictable presence at the top of men's tennis, quietly alters his preseason routine, it is never accidental. It is strategic. And this particular adjustment sends a very clear signal ahead of 2026. Before we break it down, make sure you're subscribed to World News Tennis. This is where we track the real decisions happening behind the scenes, not just the press releases. The first clue came from what didn't happen. 4 years, Sinner's off-season has followed a remarkably consistent pattern. Limited public exposure, highly structured training blocks, and an almost surgical separation between physical work, tactical preparation, and mental resets. Coaches, analysts, and even rival teams have described his preseason as boringly perfect. This time, it isn't. Multiple sources around training centers in Europe and within the Italian camp confirm that Sinner has modified one core element of his preparation, quietly removing a step that he has relied on since his early breakthrough years. Not reduced, not adjusted, removed. And crucially, the change has nothing to do with strength, speed, endurance, or recovery. This is not about the body. It's about the mind. In recent seasons, Sinner's physical evolution has been obvious. He has become one of the most reliable 5-set players on tour, one of the cleanest movers on hard courts, and statistically one of the least volatile performers under pressure. His consistency is now legendary. But inside his team, there has been a growing awareness of something else. Stability, when taken too far, can become predictability, even for the player himself. Sources close to Darren Cahill describe the concern very clearly. When a player wins this much, this consistently, the biggest danger is not decline. It is emotional flattening. The quiet loss of urgency. The feeling that you already know exactly how the season will unfold. And that is where this pre-season shift becomes important. Instead of following his traditional psychological reset protocol, one that emphasized detachment, distance from tennis environments, and delayed immersion back into competition-specific thinking, Sinner has done the opposite. He has stayed mentally engaged with the season far earlier than usual. No exhibitions, no statements, no interviews explaining it. Just a change in behavior. Normally, Sinner's camp avoids early narrative framing. They prefer silence. This year, that silence feels different. It feels intentional. People inside the ATP describe it as controlled tension. Rather than decompressing fully after 2025, Sinner has maintained a low-level competitive focus throughout the off-season. Not grinding, not burning energy, but not switching off either. Why does that matter? Because for the first time, Sinner is not chasing improvement. He is defending dominance. And that requires a very different mental posture. When players chase the top, the motivation is external. Rankings, titles, validation. When players arrive, the pressure turns inward. You start protecting rather than attacking. You become efficient instead of dangerous. Cahill has seen this before. He saw it with Andre Agassi. He saw it during the Big Three era. And he knows exactly how quickly a player can slide from hunter to caretaker without even realizing it. That's why this change exists. By removing the traditional mental off switch, Sinner's team is keeping competitive discomfort alive. He is not allowed to feel finished with the season. Not allowed to emotionally reset into comfort. Instead, everything points toward a deliberate state of readiness. Not stress, but alertness. This also explains another subtle sign that raised eyebrows. Sinner's refusal to frame 2026 publicly as a continuation year. Normally, after seasons of this level, players talk about balance, enjoyment, sustainability. Sinner hasn't. His language, when he does speak, remains short, forward-leaning, and unfinished. No celebration tone. No legacy talk. Inside the locker room, this is being interpreted as a warning. Because when Sinner is calm, methodical, and slightly uncomfortable, he is at his most dangerous. And here's the key detail that makes this urgent. This mental adjustment aligns directly with what his team identified as the only real vulnerability exposed in 2025. Moments where opponents forced emotional chaos, not tactical superiority. Not many succeeded, but when they did, the pattern was consistent. Sinner remained stable. But he didn't always impose. This preseason change is designed to fix exactly that. Not by training harder. Not by changing technique. But by altering how early, how deeply, and how continuously he stays mentally invested in the season. This is not a rest year, Sinner. This is a positioning year. And if this adjustment works, it doesn't just affect his own results. It reshapes the balance at the very top of the tour. At the center of that balance is one name everyone is thinking about, but no one is mentioning yet: Carlos Alcaraz. Because while Alcaraz thrives on emotional volatility and creative chaos, Sinner is quietly preparing to meet him from a very different psychological angle in 2026. And that's where this gets dangerous. Before we move on to what this change could mean tactically, and why rivals are paying close attention, take a second to subscribe to World News Tennis and turn on notifications. Part 2 breaks down the internal logic behind this decision and why it directly targets the biggest matches of the season. What makes this quiet preseason change especially significant is not just that it happened, but when it happened, and what it reveals about how Sinner's team now views the competitive landscape heading into 2026. Inside the ATP, timing is everything. And the timing here is not random. This adjustment comes after a season in which Sinner did almost everything right. His numbers were elite. His consistency was unmatched. His ability to survive long matches, reset after losses, and maintain focus over entire tournaments placed him firmly at the very top of the sport. Yet internally, the conclusion was not celebration. It was analysis. According to people familiar with Sinner's off-season planning, the team spent weeks dissecting not just losses, but wins, especially the matches where Sinner controlled outcomes without ever fully breaking the opponent emotionally. That distinction matters. Winning points is one thing. Winning belief is another. And this is where the mental shift becomes tactical. Historically, Sinner's strength has been precision, clean ball striking, repetition under pressure, predictable excellence. Opponents knew what was coming, and still couldn't stop it. But late in 2025, a subtle trend emerged. Against the very best players, especially in matches with emotional swings, Sinner sometimes allowed momentum to remain neutral rather than crushing it. He didn't lose control, but he didn't always seize it either. That's not a flaw for 99% of the tour. But at the very top, margins are microscopic. And when your main rival thrives on emotional chaos, as Alcaraz does, neutrality becomes a risk. This is why the change is not physical. Physically, Sinner has reached a level where gains are incremental. Marginal improvements in speed or power will not redefine his ceiling. His team knows this. The frontier now is psychological dominance. Sources describe the new approach as active engagement. Instead of mentally stepping away after the season, Sinner has remained immersed in competitive scenarios, match simulations, and opponent analysis earlier than ever before. Not obsessively, strategically. The goal is to shorten the distance between awareness and action once the season starts. In previous years, Sinner's calmness came from emotional distance. Now, that calmness is being paired with intentional tension. He is staying closer to the edge, but without tipping over it. This is a difficult balance. Most players either burn out or disengage. Very few can remain mentally sharp without becoming mentally exhausted. This is where Cahill's influence becomes critical. Cahill has long believed that elite players don't lose because they lack talent or preparation. They lose because their emotional state doesn't match the moment. In 2025, Sinner's emotional state was almost always controlled. In 2026, the goal is for it to be directed. That means choosing when to apply pressure, when to accelerate rhythm, and when to suffocate opponents psychologically, not just tactically. And here's the detail that has caught the attention of rival camps. This shift also affects how Sinner approaches the early rounds of tournaments. In the past, Sinner often used early matches as calibration. Clean wins, low drama, minimal emotional output. This year, the internal directive appears to be different. The message is simple: impose identity immediately. That doesn't mean playing riskier tennis. It means playing more assertive tennis, especially in moments where opponents are still settling into matches. Why does that matter? Because at the top level, belief is fragile. If opponents feel they are in matches against Sinner, they grow. If they feel suffocated early, they retreat. Alcaraz understands this instinctively. Sinner is now consciously training it. This is not about copying Alcaraz's style. It's about neutralizing its psychological advantage. There's another layer to this. By maintaining mental engagement throughout the off-season, Sinner is also removing a familiar excuse: I need time to find my rhythm. There will be no ramp-up period. No gradual sharpening. The expectation inside the camp is immediate execution. That puts pressure on Sinner, but it also sends a message to the tour. There will be no soft entry points in 2026. Players around the circuit are already reacting. Several coaches have privately acknowledged that preparing for Sinner next season feels different. Not because of new shots or new patterns, but because of the sense that he will arrive ready to dominate from the first ball. This matters even more when you consider the calendar. The early part of the season often defines narratives, confidence, rankings, momentum, psychological hierarchies. Sinner's team is clearly targeting that window. They don't want to chase form. They want to establish it. And that brings us to the unavoidable comparison. Alcaraz thrives on adaptation, on discovering solutions mid-match, on improvisation. Sinner's new approach is designed to reduce those opportunities. Less space, less time, less emotional oxygen. This is not an accident. This is a strategic recalibration aimed directly at the matches that decide eras. And in Part 3, we'll examine why this quiet mental shift could be the most important adjustment Sinner has made in his career, and how it might force Alcaraz to respond in ways we haven't seen before. To fully understand why this change matters, you have to look beyond Sinner himself and examine what it does to the competitive ecosystem around him. At the very top of tennis, adjustments don't exist in isolation. Every move triggers a response. Every signal is read, interpreted, and sometimes feared. And right now, the signal coming from Sinner's camp is unmistakable. This is not a player preparing to defend status. This is a player preparing to reshape the balance of power. For the last 2 seasons, the rivalry narrative has been relatively clear. Alcaraz brought unpredictability, creativity, and emotional momentum. Sinner brought control, structure, and relentless precision. Their matches became chess games between chaos and order. But chaos has an advantage when order remains passive. What Sinner's team has identified is that emotional neutrality, once a strength, can become a vulnerability against players who thrive on emotional escalation. In simple terms, if you don't seize the moment, someone else will. This realization didn't come from losses alone. It came from wins that felt incomplete. Matches where Sinner closed in straight sets but allowed opponents to believe they had been competitive. Matches where the scoreboard said dominance, but the emotional message was ambiguous. At this level, ambiguity is dangerous, because belief spreads. And belief is what turns a good opponent into a dangerous one. This is why the new approach centers on assertive psychology rather than emotional calm. Sinner is not being asked to become louder, more expressive, or more volatile. That would betray his identity. Instead, he's being trained to project inevitability. The difference is subtle, but profound. Inevitability doesn't scream. It suffocates. It's the feeling opponents get when rallies feel longer than they are, when points feel heavier, when every missed opportunity feels final. That feeling doesn't come from power or speed. It comes from mental pressure applied consistently. And that's where the shift becomes a direct challenge to Alcaraz. Because Alcaraz's greatest weapon is not his forehand or his speed. It's his ability to make opponents feel that anything can happen, at any moment. If Sinner removes that uncertainty, he changes the equation. Several analysts close to the ATP circuit have already pointed out that this adjustment could redefine how their head-to-head matches unfold. In previous encounters, Alcaraz often fed off momentum swings. A big point, a crowd reaction, a sudden injection of energy. Those moments tilted matches. Sinner's new approach aims to deny oxygen to those moments before they fully form. Not by playing safer, but by playing earlier. Earlier decisions. Earlier pressure. Earlier assertion of rhythm. This is why the change began in the off-season, not mid-year. Mental habits can't be installed overnight. They require repetition, reinforcement, and trust. And Sinner's team understands that once the season begins, there is no time to build, only to execute. This also explains why there was no public announcement. Making noise would have contradicted the purpose. The message is meant for those who know how to read it. And the message is simple. Sinner is no longer content with being the most stable player on tour. He wants to be the most imposing. There's another consequence worth noting. This shift also raises expectations internally. By staying mentally engaged through the off-season, Sinner is placing himself under pressure before the pressure arrives. That can be risky. Burnout is always a concern. But the team believes the reward outweighs the risk. Because mental fatigue comes from confusion and emotional noise. What Sinner is doing now is the opposite, reducing uncertainty, clarifying intent, and sharpening purpose. That clarity often feels energizing rather than draining. Opponents are already adjusting their preparation. Several players who typically plan slow starts against top seeds are reconsidering. The idea of settling into the match against Sinner may no longer exist. And that matters. Because tennis is a sport of anticipation. If players feel they must strike earlier, they take risks earlier. And when risks fail early, matches collapse quickly. That's dominance. Not highlight reel dominance. Structural dominance. And this is where the 2026 season could pivot. If Sinner successfully implements this mindset from the first tournaments, the ripple effects will be enormous. Rankings, seeding psychology, match dynamics, even how crowds perceive his presence. Calm can be mistaken for comfort, but calm paired with inevitability becomes intimidating. That's what Sinner is aiming for. And if it works, the conversation around him will change completely. No longer the ice-cold technician. No longer the steady counterbalance. He becomes the standard. Which leaves only one question. How does Alcaraz respond when unpredictability meets inevitability? Because if Sinner's quiet adjustment holds, the burden of creativity shifts. The risk shifts. The psychological weight shifts. What makes this situation truly significant is not the change itself, but when it's happening. This is not a mid-season correction. This is not a reaction to a loss. This is not damage control. This is a preemptive move, made before a single official ball has been struck in 2026. And that timing changes everything. The Australian Open has always been a tournament where momentum matters more than form. Heat, long matches, emotional swings, and physical stress expose weaknesses faster than anywhere else. It's where confidence either hardens into belief or cracks under pressure. By choosing to adjust his mental framework now, Sinner is effectively trying to arrive in Melbourne already playing from a position of control. Not chasing rhythm, not searching for confidence, but imposing structure from day one. Sources close to the tour have hinted that this shift will be visible not in spectacular points, but in how Sinner handles the first two rounds. Those early matches where top players often start slowly, feel out conditions, and allow opponents to linger. That's where this new approach will be tested. If Sinner begins closing matches faster, applying pressure earlier, and denying momentum swings, the rest of the field will notice immediately. And so will Alcaraz. Because make no mistake, this isn't just about personal improvement. It's about redefining the rivalry before it even resumes. For the first time, Alcaraz may enter a season knowing that the emotional windows he has relied on, the moments where matches tilt suddenly in his favor, might no longer be available. That creates a different kind of pressure. When unpredictability stops working, creativity must become precision. And that's a harder transition than it sounds. What's also striking is how quietly this has been handled. No press conferences. No motivational quotes. No public declarations. That silence is intentional. The most dangerous changes are the ones your opponents don't fully understand until it's too late. And history supports this. Some of the greatest shifts in tennis didn't come from new strokes or new coaches, but from internal decisions made months earlier. Djokovic's dietary changes, Federer's racket switch, Nadal's evolution on hard courts. None of them were loud at first, but they altered careers. Sinner's camp believes this adjustment belongs in that category. Not because it guarantees titles, nothing does, but because it changes how matches are experienced by opponents. When players stop feeling hope, matches end sooner. And that's how dominance compounds over a season. If this works, Sinner doesn't just arrive in 2026 as a contender for #1. He arrives as the player others must solve. That flips the dynamic entirely. Instead of reacting to Alcaraz's brilliance, he forces Alcaraz to react to his consistency and pressure. Instead of absorbing chaos, he dictates rhythm. And if both players remain healthy, this psychological shift could define the next phase of men's tennis. Not louder, not flashier, but more unforgiving. The Australian Open will be the first real checkpoint. Not because of who wins the trophy, but because of how matches feel. Shorter rallies, fewer emotional swings, earlier break points, less room for belief. Those are the signs to watch. Because when players start losing before the scoreboard reflects it, something fundamental has changed. And right now, all indicators suggest that Jannik Sinner is preparing to become that kind of presence. Quietly, deliberately, strategically. If you want to stay ahead of what's really happening behind the headlines, not just results, but the decisions that shape seasons, subscribe now, turn on notifications, and stay with us. The 2026 season hasn't started yet, but the power shifts already have. And this was one of them.